Hi, I'm Jill Deacon. Welcome to another episode of A Love Affair with the Unknown. I'm really excited to share today's guest with you. It is the brilliant, the best selling, and the endlessly wise Oliver Burkeman. He's chuckling. After years as a columnist for the Guardian newspaper, where he focused on productivity and time management strategies, Oliver Burkeman shot to international fame in 2021 when he published the book 4,000 Weeks. Time Management for Mortals. It became a global bestseller. 4,000 Weeks and its 2025 follow up, Meditations for Mortals, are books about how to live your life with one clear bottom line. We're not here for all that long. 4,000 weeks is roughly the amount of time we get to be alive, should we be lucky enough to live into our 80s. Oliver makes a strong case that when you look at life that way, it frees you up from a lot of illusions of being able to control much at all. So, this is Oliver Burkeman's love affair with the unknown. Oliver Burkeman, hello. Welcome to A Love Affair with the Unknown. Great to have you.
It's great to be here. Thank you for that introduction. Wow. I'll try to be endlessly wise.
Yeah, I knew you'd recoil at that because you're a humble fellow. But all humility aside, your books are super, super successful and really resonating with people. Why do you think, if you can sort of examine your work from another person's point of view, like why do you think 4,000 Weeks and Meditations for Mortals have been such successful books?
Well, that's at the risk of doing more self-deprecation. I will say that I think that luck and being in the right place at the right time and things like this are important. And actually, I think that is important to our subject matter today, right? I mean, the the way that things happen beyond our control is a real thing. I'm not just saying luck to sort of wave away your nice comments. Beyond that, I think that there has been a sense now for quite a few years. I feel like that we had sort of reached the end of the road with a certain kind of approach to uh, dealing with the modern world in a way that can leave us more sane and relaxed and calm. Right? There's been a whole sort of era of productivity advice and time management advice that I would say is premised deep down on the idea that with the right system and enough self discipline, you can finally get on top of everything. And then there has been a sort of a pushback against that, um, sometimes taking the form of suggesting that work we should just give up. There's no hope. This is like or alternatively that only big political and societal changes can make a difference to it. And I think those are important too. But I think what probably struck a chord about what I was writing about was that I was really trying to get into this idea that if you really feel your way into what it means to be as finite as we are, finite both in the amount of time we have and in the degree of control that we have over how our time unfolds and all the rest of it. When you really get into that, it isn't actually a source of like stress. You don't need to freak out. It's actually a way of kind of relaxing into the reality of this sort of overwhelming, endlessly anxiety inducing world that we live in, and functioning
Tell
quite well and getting things done and creating interesting things and all the rest of it in that context.
Tell me a bit more about that. The idea that the concept of finitude, which at first can sound, we're all going to die. What? No one likes to think about that. And yet it's ultimately so liberating.
I mean, I think there are so many ways into this shift, and I'm not sure I've ever found the perfect way of encapsulating it. But for me, it, it's in this notion that, well, so look, if you call a book 4,000 Weeks and you go around talking about the finitude of time, there's one interpretation that people are liable to put on it, which is like, okay, time is incredibly precious. It's therefore incredibly important that, in a rather stressful way, we sort of clench our fists and make sure that we're doing really extraordinary things. That we never let a day go by without some utterly unusual or wonderful accomplishment or experience. And I I own that from choosing that title. But if you really get into it, I think what you see is that actually it's our limitations are so hopelessly non-negotiable. The amount of time that we have in our lives to do anything is so tiny compared to the essentially infinite universe of things that we might want to do or could feel were important to do or all the rest of it. The idea of trying to gain a sense of control over where the world or where the future is going, it's so hopeless that actually there's a way that there's a burden that you can put down in feeling your way into that. There's a chapter in the new book, Meditations for Mortals, which I call "It's Worse Than You Think," right? It's like there's something very powerful about seeing that your lifelong quest to get on top of everything and get a handle on all your to-dos is not just really difficult, because then you end up slogging your way in hopes of getting to that moment of success. It's not really difficult. It's worse than that. It's impossible. And actually, when you see that it's worse than that, that's better, because then you can kind of drop that struggle and see that it can only ever be your job as a finite human to um, do a handful of things. It can only ever be your job to navigate in the midst of uncertainty rather than to eliminate the uncertainty. And I just find something personally, anyway, deeply, deeply sort of both relaxing and energizing about that. It's like, okay, it's not on me to try to like rewrite the terms and conditions of the human situation. So I can do the things that it is on me to do instead.
There's a great humility to it, isn't there? I'm really interested in the idea of humility, and I an image comes to me as I think about your, reminders that we're all going to die, of the Roman emperors at these public spectacles after military victories. Reportedly, there were, as they were surrounded by these crowds of admirers, some kind of assistant would whisper in the ear of these Roman emperors and generals, memento mori, remember that you too will
Mm.
die, as sort of a counterpoint to that hubris and grandeur. And there's a freedom in humility, isn't there, when it comes to, and in the context of how we handle uncertainty. In a way, it's you're saying this is a reminder of one thing we can be certain of, that we're just like everyone else. It's all going to come to an end, and there's some freedom there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's humility. It's interesting, isn't it? Because there's the risk, and maybe we all know people like this or come across them from time to time. There's a way of being sort of too humble, too self belittling, that involves kind of presenting yourself as less than you are. But we're talking here about the kind of humility that is basically just remembering that you're not God, and remembering that you are in fact a human condemned to this human situation. And if I can convey any of this properly, what I want to try to convey is the idea that that isn't a counsel of despair or a reason to sort of settle for mediocrity. It's that sort of stepping more and more fully into what it is to be limited, even though it takes humility, because you have to accept that you're not God, or at least begin to accept that, and that other people exist, and all these very annoying factors and features
Hmm.
of real life. It's actually the beginnings of something really wonderful and generative, and like that's when you can do the stuff that you're here to do. Um, it's not about sort of giving up on your hopes and dreams. It's actually about getting a chance to put one or two of them into to bring one or two of them into reality.
Tell me more about that, about how this idea of freeing ourselves up, because, we can know that intellectually that we have a finite period of
Mhm.
time here on earth, and yet we still spend our lives furiously trying to avoid thinking about it and living as though it were otherwise.
Yeah.
So what is the thing that happens? What is the shift that happens, as you describe, that when you're freed up by facing that and being mindful of that?
Well, I think it's important to say that it's a shift I'm sort of still going through. I'm not coming at this from a position of having sort of reached the final uh, destination. Um, I have definitely sort of had this experience that I think a lot of us have of, yes, grasping it intellectually, maybe even grasping it intellectually at a very deep level, but then finding that to sort of live your way into this is a whole different, I would say, kettle of fish. You might say ball of wax. I don't know how those idioms work, but it's a whole different thing
Bag of hammers.
to
Yes.
actually, right. It's a whole different thing to actually sort of embody that in in life. And it's probably ultimately beyond words, but one of the ways I often have found it useful to think about this is, and I've written about this, it's like that moment when you're sort of out in a you're caught in a rainstorm without adequate waterproofs, right? And for the first thing that often one tries to do in that situation, almost without thinking of it, is to, almost without realizing it, is to sort of keep yourself from getting wet by kind of hunching your shoulders or like looking down, whatever it is. You're trying to sort of avoid the reality that you're in. And then there's like a moment that sometimes comes if the rain is heavy enough when you just realize, like, oh, I'm just going to get really soaking wet here. And there's a whole bodily relaxation into that reality. And of course, like, there's a deep sense. I'm obviously, I chose the metaphor in this way, but like there's a deep sense in which it doesn't matter at all uh, that you're soaking wet, right? The problem, the suffering, was caused by resisting this situation, and sort of relaxing and unclenching into it is not only fine, but kind of maybe exhilarating, kind of maybe energizing in a way. And I think I bring that up just because I think it's that gesture, whether intellectual, that's definitely got a fully sort of embodied aspect to it. It's that sort of, oh, I can actually afford to, yeah, like re- unclench
Surrender
into
to the
the
to the
reality
present
that I
moment.
am in,
Mhm.
right? It's like I'm in it anyway. This isn't about some other kind of meaning of the word surrender, meaning, I don't know, subjugating yourself, or sort of living at a lower level of inner authority than you could. It's like it's just feeling that things are in fact the way they are, and the sense of
And yet
power and
that
sort of
can be
aliveness that comes from that. Sorry, yeah.
yeah, and it I know exactly, I think everybody who hears you say that will know exactly that moment when we've done that in a rainstorm and felt like, "Okay, I'm leaning into this, and you know what? It actually is kind of amazing," and there's a giddy,
Mm.
childish freedom that comes with that.
But not where human death
How
is involved. You're going to say now, right?
right, and how do you and I know this isn't an easy question to answer, but the kinds of unknowns and uncertainties and or circumstances that we resist because gosh, this doesn't feel like how I want it to be, you know, um, from our that have different stakes than getting wet. How do we embrace the reality of our present moment when the consequences feel more dire than having to change our clothes?
It's a great question. I think for me, in terms of what progress I've made in my own being in this way, it it comes from seeing how this thing that we're talking about arises at sort of every different level of life and every different kind of experience. So that in some sense, the very faint knot in my stomach that I might feel when I realize how many unanswered emails there are in my inbox and start sort of restlessly trying to strategize for how I can get on top of that. It it's in some way the same thing as when I realize that somebody I love is really angry at me, or that something terrible has befallen somebody who I care about, and then up and up and up towards, the horrors in the news headlines and the fact that we're all going to die and all the rest of it. Like, all of that is some kind of thing that makes us feel sort of imprisoned by reality. All of that is something where when you relax into the reality of it, you realize that either a lot of the pain or maybe all of the suffering, depending on how you want to sort of frame the language, was in the resistance of it. So you start small and you start sort of uh, allowing yourself to experience what it's really like to be human in the context of your to-do list, and you feel those feelings, and you get a bit better at it in the context of human relationships and a bit better at it in the context of distressing situations. And like, I don't know, I'm not going to make a claim to have got especially far along that axis, but I think it's all the same thing on some level. And that's a powerful insight because it means that actually you have you can you can prepare in some sense for the worst moments of life through a different attitude towards the very low level stresses of life.
And I mean, part of what you write about in Meditations for Mortals is a direct counterpoint to the anxiety that people feel about uncertainty. Um, and I'm thinking specifically of a chapter that you call Let the Future Be the Future. Um, and you talk a little bit there, and I'd love you to explain this sort of your argument about how a modern day worrier um, actually sort of has things
Mm.
backwards in our fear of what might happen.
Yeah, and as I write in that chapter, I was just like, I'd obviously heard people say like, "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," many, many, many times in my life, but it was only like a few years ago that the real force of that hit me. Like, there is something so profound in that idea for a lot of us because I think I don't, I shouldn't include you, but you can tell me if it is you. It certainly has been me. We just assume that the way to try to feel somewhat safer in the world and somewhat more secure in the world is to put a lot of effort into trying to figure out um, all the things that could be coming up, all the bridges we might have to cross, and how we would cross them so that we can be
Yes.
certain that,
Planning for
that we've
them.
crossed them.
Yes.
And of course, there's two problems with this. One is that um, you can't imagine what bridges you're going to have to cross. Time and again, the things we worry about never happen. But when on the rare occasions that really bad things happen, they're very often like out of a clear blue sky. We weren't expecting them. And secondly, that real reassurance that you want of like, I crossed this bridge safely. You're obviously never going to get it until you've actually crossed the bridge, right? The part of you can think your way across that bridge, but the rest of you knows that you're not over it until you actually get over it. So that's why sort of compulsive worry has this feeling of like constantly reaching for something that can't be grasped. But there's a lovely line from Marcus Aurelius's Meditations that I quote in the book, where he says something like, "Don't let the future disturb you, because you'll meet it if you have to with the same weapons of reason." That's a translation anyway. That today arm you against the present. It's got nothing to do with reason or combat. I don't think anyway. I think the real insight here is like, as you say, we get it back to front. We worry and try and spend all our time in the present worrying about the future because we sort of, on some level, don't trust ourselves to meet the future when it comes with, uh, you know, skill, with calm, with our various inner resources. But by doing all the worrying, on some level, we sort of trust ourselves too much in the present to be able to sort out everything that could be coming in the future. So it's backwards. It's like, actually, you you shouldn't put so much faith in your ability to plan it all out from this vantage point in the present, but you should have rather more faith than you have in the idea that as and when this thing happens, if it even happens, as the Marcus quote reminds us, right? Most of the things won't, but if it does, like, you'll still be you with your ability to deal with things. And you clearly do have this ability, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. and you certainly wouldn't have any of the sort of accomplishments or the things that you're proud of in your life, right? Plainly, um, I've got what it takes not to be completely destroyed by life at the first unexpected crisis. So why can't I, you know, have a little more trust in that situation, uh, should it arise in the future?
Why can't I have a love affair with the unknown, you might say.
Right.
That's the idea here, and it is such a hard thing to wrap our heads around in some respects, like and it's what you were talking about earlier, that the what's opened up by being here with what we do have is part and parcel of changing our relationship with what we don't know about what we may have to deal with in the future, and that to me is a love affair with the unknown. What's your idea? What do you think of that that turn of phrase? What does it mean to you, the idea of a love affair with the unknown?
It reminds me of an idea or a phrasing that crops up sometimes in, I think, Zen Buddhist sources, which is something like trying to convey the idea that that doubt is the only security, that there's a sort of security, that there's a sort of coming to rest in uh, in uncertainty that isn't possible in certainty, because certainty, we always know on some level, is an illusion, right? If we think something is guaranteed, there's some part of us that kind of knows that it isn't. But there's something
Yeah.
sort of absolutely embracing about the unknown. Yeah, it doesn't make logical sense, I don't think, but it's like there's something about that which is like I can unclench, I can relax into the rainstorm in that way. And there's some famous line, I forget which Buddhist teacher it comes from. It might be Chogyam Trungpa, something like um, this famous line that like the bad news is you're falling without a safety net, but the good news is there's no ground. And I think that I think that really captures it as well, right? There is this kind of fundamental, just it suffuses everything to such a degree that there's something you can relax into about it, um, if that makes sense on any level.
On a practical level, I think it is, as you point out. No, I no, I that's beautiful. We'll chew on that one for a while. Um, y you talk in your books about, um, these very practical strategies for helping us get our heads around, and sort of wrestle with letting go of this, as you say, let the future be the future. Stop trying to get everything under control, because there is no control, there is no ground, there is no final
Mhm.
destination where all the i's are dotted and the t's are crossed. I think I heard you say, or did I read it in one of your books, that life is not a puzzle to be solved. I just found that so incredibly freeing,
This is
because it's amazing how often I can wake up in a morning and think, okay, so if I do this and then I catch this train and then and then if I get okay and I'll bring that bag and carry those groceries, and it's just like a little jigsaw puzzle that I'm somehow habitually trying to solve in my head, and that's not at all a recipe for getting joy, and full aliveness out of a given day. It might be fairly productive, and there's some benefit to some of that, but I love the idea this is not a puzzle to be solved.
I I have written about that and quoted it. I think again, I think of it as a Zen idea, and actually, I usually quote it as not a problem to be solved. So I really there's a real cool nuance that is added by the word puzzle, right? Because it's like moving the pieces, and there's a
Right.
there's a solution that is expected of me. Uh, and yeah, if you want to put life in those terms, then you know, in a it becomes a sort of battle with time, or a sort of contest against life, and like time is always going to win that one in the end, right? It's like that's it's not that
Right.
you're not going to be winning that, but of course, there's no reason to think of it in that way, as opposed to an experience to be lived and, dare we say it, even enjoyed.
You write a lot about the energy that we invest in sort of those efforts of solving problems and solving puzzles, um, i really ultimately trying to avoid the reality in which we find ourselves. Why do you think we do, as humans, really struggle so much to have a love affair with the unknown, whatever you wanna call it, to just be sitting in the rainstorm in that present moment? Why is that so hard?
I mean, I wish I knew. I think that I can see sort of layers of answers to that question, and I do think that right at the bottom of it, it's just that we are these creatures who are simultaneously capable of conceiving of the idea of death, capable of conceiving of all the things we'd like to do, regardless of how much time we have, but at the same time are just as um, finite and uh, like animals as are dogs. But one, so far as we know, one assumes that they are not troubled by that kind of prospective, possibility based counterfactual thinking. So I think that's just like who we are, and there are people who will say, well, that's because actually we're destined for eternal life in the afterlife, and there are people who will say that's because evolution doesn't really have any interest in our happiness. If it's useful for us to have these skills in order to survive, the fact that it gives us existential crises is no concern of evolution's. Um, but then I think there are lots of different ways in which the world that we have built compounds this situation. Um, I've written about how like the objectification of time, partly through the sort of process of industrialization, uh, exacerbates this because now
What do you mean by the
well,
objectification of
we sort of
time?
start to think about time as this thing that we have a relationship with that we can use wisely or badly. When I think it's reasonable to infer that a medieval peasant without access to clocks, early medieval times, would just have experienced time and the unfolding of life as one and the same thing. Terrible life in many many ways, but not with this kind of affliction of well, there's this timeline running next to me, and I've got to keep up with it, and I've got to fit things into the right chunks of time. Otherwise, I'm a loser and lazy and all this stuff. And just the ability to sell your time, which is something that largely emerges from the industrial revolution, and to
Mm,
buy time, and then
time is money,
right, and
baby.
then to want
Yep.
your as the sort of industrialist to want the time you're buying to be to want to squeeze as much value out of the people who are selling you their time in shifts as you possibly can, and all that. Um, and of course, then all the technologies that since then have promised to help us get on top of time, to get in control of time. So, so this is only specifically looking at it through the lens of time, but there are all these different ways in the modern world that it almost feels like it ought to be possible to get out of this very troubling situation of being finite. I think that makes it worse, and I think that the pressures of an economic system that make it feel like you sort of have to do this if you're going to have any chance of keeping your head above water, provide another motivation for it. So there's all these different ways in which we feel that we have to get out from under human finitude, all these other ways in which we feel like we maybe could now with one last heave. um, and it's just very unpleasant anyway, so we'll happily do things that make us feel like we're a few weeks or months away from finally not having to deal with it anymore. I think that's what's going on in a lot of how we relate to time, and I think yeah, that's part of why.
And you talk about a strategy of consciously neglecting things, as kind of a practice to help us get off that control-seeking productivity path that a lot of people are on. Tell me what you mean by that, and what kinds of things are you neglecting?
So yes, so I mean, consciously neglecting things is the crucial consciously is the crucial word here, because I think a lot
Yes.
of what I'm writing and a lot of what we're talking about here, it isn't really about living differently in the way that we normally mean that kind of phrase. It's about becoming more conscious of the ways in which things always already, as they say, always already were, and experiencing the liberation and the energy and actually the sort of even productivity, right? There's all sorts of gains to be had from feeling consciously what was in fact already the case. So,
Give me an example of what you mean
well,
by
on the
that.
biggest picture, right? I'm not suggesting we should live finite lives. I'm suggesting we do live finite lives, and that there's some benefit to be taken from feeling our way into that truth in a more full throated way. And in the case of the obvious example is in the context of neglect, right? Of neglecting things. To live as a human, and certainly to live as a human in the modern world, is to choose every single day to not do vast numbers, perhaps an infinite number of things that would be really meaningful and important things to do. Because to do anything, you have to neglect all the other things. Um, and
Right, we're making
right,
choices every
right,
day. By
that's
virtue
happening.
of
That yeah,
saying, "I'm going for a bike ride,"
right,
we are consciously neglecting watching that new show everyone's raving
right,
about
right,
on
and
TV.
that's happening whether
Right.
you do it consciously or unconsciously. You're always choosing, and I think that the main thing I'm gesturing towards is just like if you can gently lead yourself into choosing and knowing that you're doing it instead of choosing and not knowing that you're doing it. This is a recipe for a more authentic feeling and a more sane and relaxed life because you make some better choices. You're less prone to just blindly follow the agendas of others or the agendas of the attention economy or whatever. Um, and more than that, you have a different relationship to what goes undone and what is neglected, right? You sort of you don't you're going to be less prone to beat yourself up about not doing everything when you really clearly understand what it means to be human
Right.
and not be able to do everything. So sorry, go on.
Well, just I'm just gonna sort of like give an example or an
Yeah.
illustration perhaps of what I think you're saying, which is the attention economy, you know, the image that comes to my mind is sitting on our devices, scrolling and seeing an ad for something or a link or promotion or something that we think, oh, I must watch that or do I need to have that? And sort of that's an unconscious use of our energy and our time as opposed to consciously deciding to neglect whatever those distractions are and consciously choosing to do whatever we decide to do instead. Is that sort of make by taking a bit of conscious ownership of our choices and what we do in a day, we become more present to the day we're having and the way we're being in our finite amount of time, and we're feeling a bit more agency as
Totally.
opposed to being
Yeah,
pulled by this distraction or this another one over here.
absolutely. And like, I want to sort of like to give another version of it. Let's like push the example away from that sort of very familiar and real experience, right? But push it into something where the choices is between two things that we think are just really good. If you are someone like I am, who broadly finds their work kind of fulfilling and also has family, there's often and also has some autonomy over how you, and this is none of these things necessarily true for everyone, but like there are occasions in my life all the time where I do on some level have a choice between putting in another hour on a certain work project or being present with the people that I live with. And if you sort of
Both options you love, but you're having to make a choice
right, and
to
like
to
right, and
and
it's like in that hour, let's say, let's not get into half hours and splitting the time, right? In that hour, it's got to be one or the other. And a lot of sort of conventional writing on work-life balance, for example, will make you feel like you must be able to find a way to feel like you're giving enough to both of those. Um, a sort of generally anxious, unconscious approach to being finite will have you sort of not enjoy whichever you choose because you're thinking primarily about how you ought to be doing the other one. And a more conscious approach says, like, yeah, it is sad that I can't use that hour for the other thing. No, it just is. Like, it's disappointing. And and that's the price that I pay for this hour to do the other one. And something about acknowledging that price gives more meaning to the thing
Hmm.
that I choose. And then, of course, there's balance because I want to make sure over the course of a week that, you know, the work projects get the time they deserve and I'm not just ignoring my family, and this applies to a million different examples of, this, that I'm just giving some one context, but it's that sort of conscious understanding that, like, yeah, it would be great if I could be in two places at once. I don't have to convince myself that the other thing doesn't really matter very much. That, I think, we're often finding ourselves doing, right? We're trying to say, like, well, this is what I'm doing, so it must mean that I don't care so much about the other thing, or I don't know, I'm a bad person because I don't care so much about the other thing. It's like, no, it's just that there's a choice in this hour.
It's just finitude, baby. Um, you've talked about the idea of cosmic insignificance and how if we I'll let you sort of explain it better, but the idea that our 4,000 weeks seem that's not a very big number to us when you put it that way. And yet that 4,000 weeks is a blink of an eye in sort of the history of the cosmos. And if we think of our tiny little blink of time that we get to be here, if we think of it that way from that wide open lens, it's also quite liberating and it frees us up to take risks and to try things. Um, I've heard you say if you feel like you want to paint, but you don't know if you're a good enough painter, or if you want to write, but you don't know if you're a good enough writer. Even Shakespeare he only had 4,000 weeks too. And he's a blink of an eye in this cosmos as well. So there's, again, just kind of who cares? Just go for it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a few layers to this, and in some ways, I feel like I think in the most recent book, I've probably got there, but uh, it's somewhere that I've sort of understood more of even since I wrote 4,000 Weeks, right? So, yes, first of all, there is a natural tendency towards great egocentricity, right? In the idea that uh, you get stressed out about things because the stakes seem so high, decisions, whether you're up to whether you've got what it takes to do something, and this idea of putting yourself in the cosmic context really sort of relieves the pressure on that because all stakes are low from the perspective of cosmic time. Um, you know, you don't need to worry about whether, yes, the piece of writing you put together or the art that you paint, you don't need to worry whether it's going to, you know, last forever and be truly meaningful for the rest of time, because it definitely isn't going to be. And so in that sort of cutting of yourself down to size, there's a lot of freedom. I think also, and as I say, this is something that I'm still figuring out how to describe, but I think it's also beyond that, the opportunity to kind of redefine what mattering means. So I'm not just saying you're absolutely tiny, nothing matters, therefore you don't have to stress, because then someone could rightfully come along and say, well, if nothing matters, why do anything? Like, why not be immensely depressed about the pointlessness of human existence? And I think the response to that is to say, I'm drawing here on work by the philosopher Ido Landau, I should say, like, no, the problem here is your definition of mattering, right? The problem here is the idea that something doesn't matter unless it has cosmic significance, unless it lasts forever, unless it affects everyone in the world, something like that. Like, this actually releases us to see that something can really matter if it changes a few people's lives, or if it you know, um, bring makes us feel more alive in the doing of it. And if it just matters now, like why should something have to matter later for it to matter? Um, it's very hard to justify all sorts of things that we know are meaningful, like cooking nutritious meals for our kids or caring for relatives or making our neighborhoods look beautiful, right? It's very hard to justify any of that if your standard is like, this will really have made a difference to the overall course of humanity 1,000 years from now. And sometimes people try to say, well, it will, but just in a way that you can't predict. And it's like, but why do I even need that standard? Like, I know it matters. And so you get this wonderful notion that actually maybe part of making your life more meaningful is not in radical changes to what you're doing, but in understanding more deeply that things you're already doing are more meaningful than you'd realized. I think that's very powerful myself.
Mm, that is so powerful. Um, and a beautiful note to end on. This conversation is very meaningful to me, whether anybody hears it or not. So I know they will, but it doesn't have to last for all of time. It's been just lovely time to talk with you, Oliver. Thank you so much for this.
It's a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it as well.